At 5:42 in the morning, under a low Zaporizhia sky, still gray with the dust of overnight artillery, the first Ukrainian assault groups crossed the Dragon's Teeth southwest of Novodanilivka and did not stop where every Russian war plan said they would. They kept moving. They moved through the minefield channels that were supposed to be sealed. They moved past the trench line that Sergei Surovikin himself had personally inspected. They moved into ground that on every Russian general staff map was colored as permanent. And by the time the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army understood what was happening on its left flank, the Ukrainian forward elements were already 3 kilometers deep inside what the Kremlin has spent 3.5 years calling unbreakable. This is not a story about a tactical breach. This is a case study in what happens when an army builds a fortress for the war it imagined and forgets to build it for the war it is actually fighting. I want you to understand something before we go any further. The Surovikin Line was never just concrete and barbed wire. It was a political artifact. It was the physical expression of a doctrine, the doctrine that said a properly fortified Russian defense in depth with kill zones, pre-sighted artillery, layered minefields, and roughly 80,000 troops bedded down behind it could absorb anything Ukraine threw at it for as long as Moscow needed. That doctrine has just failed in public. And the 80,000 men currently sitting between Tokmak and Polohi are not panicking because Ukraine moved a flag on a map. They are panicking because the assumption that kept them alive has been deleted. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Pull the lens back to the autumn of 2022. After the humiliating Russian collapse around Kharkiv, after the forced withdrawal from Kherson City, Vladimir Putin handed Sergei Surovikin a single narrow mission: stabilize the south, build something so dense, so deep, and so technically forbidding that the next Ukrainian counteroffensive would shatter against it. Surovikin took that mission seriously. By the spring of 2023, satellite imagery from commercial providers and from Western intelligence services showed the result. A defensive belt stretching from the Sea of Azov coast through Tokmak, Robotyne, Verbov, and west toward the Dnipro, 3 layered echelons deep, fronted by anti-tank ditches, Dragon's Teeth in staggered rows, and minefields planted at densities that Western engineers had not seen since the Iran-Iraq War. In some sectors, there were 5 mines per square meter. 5? That is not a defensive line. That is a deliberate attempt to make ground unwalkable. And for a while it worked. The 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, the one Western capitals had loaded up with Leopards and Bradleys and engineering vehicles, broke its teeth on exactly this terrain. Robotyne was taken. Verbov was contested, but the deeper belt held. Tokmak did not fall. The land bridge to Crimea did not snap, and Russian strategic planners drew exactly the wrong lesson from that summer. They concluded that the Surovikin Line was a permanent solution to the structural problem of Russian inferiority in maneuver. They concluded that fortifications could substitute for adaptation. That was the first mistake. It was not tactical. It was psychological. Now bring the lens forward, because what changed between 2023 and this morning is not the concrete. The concrete is still there. The Dragon's Teeth are still there. The minefields are still there. What changed is the war around them. In early February of this year, Russian forces across the southern theater lost reliable access to Starlink terminals after a coordinated effort by Ukrainian cyber units, and Western technical partners cut the gray market data flows that had been illegally sustaining Russian command and reconnaissance nodes. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency confirmed this in its quarterly assessment released last week. That single change degraded the Russian ability to coordinate drone reconnaissance, artillery correction, and electronic warfare handoffs across the southern front. The Surovikin Line was designed in 2022 and 2023 as an integrated system. It depended on its sensors, its drones, and its lateral communications being faster than the attackers. Strip out the connective tissue, and what you have left is not a defensive system. It is a museum of fortifications. And it gets even more serious from here. Because in parallel, throughout the winter and into the spring, Ukraine has done something that almost no Western analyst predicted in 2023. Ukraine has converted its mid-range strike campaign into a true battlefield air interdiction doctrine. The Institute for the Study of War has been documenting it in their daily assessments throughout April and May. Strikes on the M14 highway, strikes on the H20 highway, strikes on Russian logistics, nodes 30, 40, 130 kilometers behind the line. The Kherson Occupation Administration under Vladimir Saldo just signed a decree last Thursday restricting freight traffic along the primary land route between Russia and Crimea because Ukrainian drones have made daylight movement on that road operationally suicidal. A Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger publicly criticized the decree, complaining that any large vehicle on that highway is now assumed to be a military target. Let that sink in. The occupation authority is restricting Russian military logistics because Russian military logistics can no longer survive Ukrainian observation. This is the hidden variable that mainstream coverage of the Surovikin breach is missing. The line did not fail because Ukrainian armor finally arrived in sufficient mass. The line failed because the army behind the line was already being strangled before the assault began. Pull the lens back again. What you are witnessing is not a single breach. It is the operational consequence of a systemic dismantling. Russian forces in April of this year, for the first time since August of 2024, suffered a net loss of territory across the entire Ukrainian theater. That is not a Ukrainian press release. That is ISW reporting, drawing on geolocated combat footage that anyone with a laptop can verify. The Russian rate of advance through the first quarter of this year collapsed to roughly 5 square kilometers per day, down from nearly 11 the year before. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated this week that Russian forces have lost an average of 1,021 personnel killed, wounded, or captured per day so far in 2026. Over 800 prisoners taken. At least 59,000 seriously wounded. These are not the numbers of an army winning a war of attrition. These are the numbers of an army being ground forward by political will alone, while the operational and logistical foundations underneath that will quietly disintegrate. And this matters enormously because the Surovikin Line was supposed to be the firewall that prevented exactly this scenario. The whole purpose of the line was to allow Russia to absorb the strategic pressure of a sustained Ukrainian campaign without losing the south. That firewall is now compromised, and the 80,000 troops behind it know it. Let me show you the chronology because the chronology is the proof. Through January and February, Ukrainian forces began probing operations in the western Zaporizhia salient, focusing initially on the seam between the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army and the 49th Combined Arms Army, the seam that has been quietly bleeding personnel since the 2023 counteroffensive damaged the cohesion of the original defending formations. In late February, Ukrainian units gained roughly 200 square kilometers of territory in 5 days. That number was reported by the Adapt Institute and cross-referenced by Western military observers as the fastest 5-day Ukrainian territorial gain of the entire war. 200 square kilometers in a sector where every Russian doctrinal document since 2023 promised that Ukrainian gains would be measured in meters. Through March, Ukrainian forces consolidated and pushed the seam wider. The New York Times reported in late March that Ukrainian command had quietly redeployed brigades into Zaporizhia that had previously been committed to the Pokrovsk defensive battle. That redeployment was the operational signal that Kiev had decided to convert tactical momentum into a strategic offensive in the south. Through April, the pattern accelerated. Russian forces lost ground net for the month. Ukrainian advances were geolocated and confirmed in the Borova, Slovyansk, and Pokrovsk directions, but also critically in western Zaporizhia Oblast. And now we arrive at this week. Geolocated footage published on May 21st confirms Ukrainian advances southwest of Novodanilivka, deep into what every Russian map calls the first echelon of the Surovikin belt. A Kremlin-affiliated military blogger, not a Ukrainian source, a Russian source, openly acknowledged that Ukrainian forces now largely control Mala-Tokmachka after a series of recent counterattacks. ISW's assessment of May 22nd confirms that Ukrainian forces are continuing to counterattack in western Zaporizhia Oblast, while Russian forces conduct only what ISW describes as limited ground attacks in the area. Limited. That is the operational vocabulary of an army that has lost the initiative. This is the moment where mainstream framing will get the story wrong. The mainstream framing will treat this as a local breakthrough. A few kilometers of ground, a few villages flipped on a map. That framing is too shallow. The broader lesson here is that the Russian theory of the war in the south has just collapsed. Let me explain the doctrinal point, because the doctrinal point is the whole game. A defense in depth, the kind of layered echelon belt that Surovikin built, is not a wall. It is a system. It works on 3 interdependent assumptions. The first assumption is that the defender has continuous situational awareness across the entire belt. so that any penetration in the first echelon can be sealed by repositioning reserves from the second. The second assumption is that the defender retains uncontested logistics behind the belt, so that those reserves can actually be moved, fed, and supplied. The third assumption is that the defender's command and control survives the attacker's strike campaign long enough to make coordinated decisions. Take away any one of those three pillars, and the entire structure becomes a static obstacle, not a living defense. Ukraine has now degraded all three. Situational awareness was crippled by the Starlink cutoff and by Ukraine's drone versus drone counter-reconnaissance campaign, which is now generating over 34,000 Russian casualties per month by Ukrainian estimates, the bulk of them attributable to unmanned systems. Logistics behind the belt are being interdicted nightly on the M14, the H-20, and adjacent secondary routes. Command and control is being targeted by mid-range Ukrainian strike packages against headquarters elements, communications nodes, and warehouses up to 130 kilometers behind the line, with the Rubicon Drone Center near Starobilsk struck just this week. The defense in depth is no longer in depth. It is just a line. And lines in modern war are temporary. This is what the 80,000 men behind the Surovikin belt understand in their bones, even if Moscow refuses to admit it on television. They understand that the structural advantages that kept them alive for 2.5 years have eroded. They understand that the reserves they were promised cannot move as freely as the doctrine assumed. They understand that the drones overhead are not theirs. They understand that the highway behind them is restricted. They understand that the line they were told was unbreakable is being walked through sector by sector by an enemy that 2 years ago could not break it at all. And it gets even more serious from here. Because the breach itself is not the climax. The climax is what the breach enables. Pull the lens back to the strategic geometry. The entire Russian position in the south is anchored on the land bridge from Rostov through Mariupol to Crimea. That land bridge depends on three things: Tokmak as the central road and rail node, Melitopol as the logistics hub, and the M14 highway as the artery. The Surovikin Line, in its original conception, existed to protect that geometry by holding Ukrainian forces north of Tokmak. Every kilometer of advance southwest of Orikhiv and southwest of Novodanilivka brings Ukrainian artillery, drone, and HIMARS coverage closer to Tokmak. And the closer that coverage gets, the less defensible Melitopol becomes. And the less defensible Melitopol becomes, the more the entire southern theater begins to resemble Kherson in October of 2022, when a Russian force that looked secure on paper suddenly found itself untenable in reality. The real question is not whether Ukraine can hold what it has taken this week. The real question is whether the Russian command in the south still has the operational coherence to prevent the breach from becoming a rupture. And the honest answer drawn from the available evidence is that the indicators are not encouraging for the Kremlin. Bloomberg reported just yesterday that senior Kremlin officials are quietly describing the war as having reached a dead end. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated publicly this week that Ukraine's defenses are stabilizing the front line and that Ukrainian territorial gains are no longer isolated incidents. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment from May 18th, which I would encourage every serious viewer to read, identifies the Starlink cutoff as a direct contributor to Ukrainian territorial gains. These are not propaganda statements. These are sober institutional assessments from people who have no incentive to overstate Ukrainian progress. What happens next changes everything. If Ukraine can convert this week's tactical breach into operational depth, if Ukrainian forces can push the salient south and east through the summer, the Surovikin Line stops being a defensive belt and becomes a captured asset. The Dragon's Teeth become Ukrainian forward positions. The trench systems become Ukrainian shelter. The minefields painstakingly cleared by Ukrainian engineers become buffer zones against Russian counterattack. That is the inversion that Moscow has spent 3.5 years and an estimated tens of billions of rubles trying to prevent. And it is happening. The broader pattern this confirms is the one I have been describing on this channel for months. Russia is not losing because Ukraine is overwhelming. Russia is losing because Russia keeps fighting the war it planned in 2022 against an enemy that has rebuilt itself into something entirely different. The Russian theory of victory has been static for 3 years: build walls, hold ground, outlast the West. The Ukrainian theory of victory has evolved every 6 months. Drones, then long-range strike, then logistics interdiction, then battlefield air interdiction, then doctrine reform, then now finally a return to maneuver under conditions that favor the attacker. The adaptation asymmetry is total. One army learns, the other army digs. And history will record that the Surovikin Line, the great fortified achievement of Russian defensive doctrine in this war, was not breached because Ukraine became overwhelming. It was breached because Russia stopped adapting and Ukraine never did. So where does this leave the 80,000 men behind the line tonight? It leaves them in the position every soldier in history has dreaded. They are sitting in fortifications that were promised to be permanent, behind logistics that are being strangled, under skies they no longer control, taking orders from a command structure that is being struck nightly, defending a doctrine that has just publicly failed. They are not panicking because of propaganda. They are panicking because their situational picture, the one their officers cannot fully share with them, tells them that the firewall is gone. And once the firewall is gone, in any defense in depth, the question stops being whether the line will hold and starts being how far the rupture will run before someone restores coherence. The honest forecast is that the next 60 days will determine whether this is a local breach or a strategic inflection. If Russian command can rush operational reserves into the Tokmak axis and reseal the seam, the line stabilizes further south, the war grinds on, and the 80,000 survive their current crisis. If Russian command cannot, because Starlink is gone, because the highways are interdicted, because the reserves are already committed to Pokrovsk and Sumy and the Oskil, then what we are watching this week is the beginning of the unraveling of the Southern theater. And the unraveling of the Southern theater is the unraveling of the entire Russian war effort, because the Southern theater is where the land bridge is, and the land bridge is where Crimea hangs. I do not say this lightly. I have spent decades studying how armies move, how they fail, and how they recover. The pattern I am describing is not unique to this war. It is the pattern of Caporetto in 1917, when a defensive system that had held for 2 years collapsed in days once its connective tissue was severed. It is the pattern of the Mareth Line in 1943, when fortifications that looked formidable on a map became irrelevant once the enemy fought the war the defender had not prepared for. It is the pattern of every defense in depth that has failed in modern history. The pattern is always the same. The fortifications do not fall. The system around them fails first, and then the fortifications are simply walked past. That is what is happening southwest of Novodanilivka tonight. The fortifications are not falling. The system around them is failing, and the 80,000 troops behind the line are the ones who will live or not with the consequences of a doctrinal choice that was made 3 years ago in Moscow by men who assumed that concrete could substitute for adaptation. It cannot. It never could. And the war is now teaching that lesson in real time, in a salient west of Orikhiv, in geolocated footage that anyone with the patience to look can verify. The question I am left with, and the question I want you to sit with tonight, is whether Moscow still has the institutional honesty to recognize what has just happened. Because if Moscow understands the meaning of this breach, the Kremlin will be forced into choices it has spent 3 years avoiding. And if Moscow does not understand the meaning of this breach, then the next assessment I bring you on this channel will describe a Southern theater that looks materially different from the one we have been watching since 2023. This is the kind of inflection point that does not announce itself with banners. It announces itself with a Russian mill blogger admitting quietly that Malotokmachka is largely under Ukrainian control. It announces itself with an occupation governor restricting traffic on his own supply highway. It announces itself with senior Kremlin officials whispering to Bloomberg that the war has reached a dead end. It announces itself in the small, technical, easily missed details that, taken together, describe an army that has lost the structural advantages it built its entire campaign around. I will keep tracking this for you. We are going to be following the Tokmak axis closely in the coming weeks, because what happens in that single sector will tell us more about the future shape of this war than any summit, any speech, or any headline. If you want that analysis, if you want the doctrinal lens rather than the cable news lens, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. We are pushing toward a goal that lets us expand the depth and frequency of these assessments, and every subscriber moves us closer to it. You will not get this read of the battlefield from mainstream coverage. You will get it here. Stay with me. Because the questions that matter now, whether the breach becomes a rupture, whether the 80,000 hold or break, whether Moscow adapts or doubles down, do not have simple answers. But they are about to have answers. And when they do, we will be the first to walk you through what they actually mean. history will record this week. The only thing left to determine is what it will record next.